welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a really profound moment in Genesis 47, looking at this massive, dramatic clash between a worldly empire and a divine promise. This text functions as a critical narrative hinge. It literally connects the patriarchal sojourning in Canaan to the actual formation of Israel as a nation inside Egypt. And it does all of this against the wild backdrop of a catastrophic global famine, which ultimately sets the stage for what I think is one of the most powerful acts of faith in the ancient world, Jacob's oath of return.
So let's just jump right into this provocative question, because the answer totally transforms what looks like, a simple ancient burial request into a revolutionary act of faith. It's an act that completely defies the most powerful nation in the world. We're looking at a man who experiences unprecedented prosperity in a foreign land, yet he uses his absolute final moments to effectively reject the whole thing. To understand why Jacob's oath of return is so central to the biblical narrative, we first have to look at the incredible circumstances of how he even got there.
All right, let's start with Section 1, Refuge in a Foreign Land. Now, to really get why this ultimate rejection of Egypt is such a big deal, we need to see how Israel settled there in the first place during this massive agricultural catastrophe. And what's fascinating is how God providentially uses an occupational taboo as a strategic barrier. Joseph actually tells his brothers to explicitly declare their trade as shepherds to the Egyptians. Now, to the Imperial Egyptian culture, shepherding was considered a tuteva, an absolute abomination. And it is deeply ironic, and honestly a bit funny, that being labeled a total abomination is exactly what landed them the absolute best real estate in the empire, isolating the Israelites in the super fertile region of Goshen. So why does this matter? Well, by keeping them geographically separated, Yahweh effectively shielded his people during a highly vulnerable developmental stage. They were transitioning from just a single family into a nation in formation. If they had integrated seamlessly into Egyptian society, they would have faced total cultural assimilation, intermarriage, and they would have ended up adopting the local worship of Egyptian gods. But instead, the structural barrier of their occupation meant they wouldn't just blend into that dominant culture. They were entirely preserved.
Moving right along to Section 2, the patriarch blesses Pharaoh.
Okay, let's head right into the royal court, because this is where that isolation builds in to just an incredible inversion of power. Picture the contrast here. On the left side, you have Pharaoh. In the ancient world, he's viewed as a divine king, literally the earthly incarnation of gods like Ra or Horus, controlling the world's absolute greatest empire. And then on the right, you have Jacob. He's this 130-year-old frail landless refugee who is just fleeing a global famine. Yet, in this encounter, the literary structure flips everything completely on its head. The seemingly powerless refugee is actually the superior spiritual authority, dispensing divine favor and blessing upon the so-called God King of Egypt.
And during this exchange, Pharaoh actually asks Jacob how old he is. Jacob replies that his years have been 130, and amazingly, he describes them as few. A man who has lived 130 years considers them few and fleeting, marked by all sorts of afflictions. But the real keyword he uses here is gur. When Jacob describes his life as a gur, a sojourner or a pilgrim, he is establishing the psychological and spiritual foundation for the rest of his life. He's anchoring himself in God's transcendent promise plan. He absolutely does not view his present earthly conditions as his final inheritance, no matter how comfortable they might become.
Which brings us to Section 3, thriving amidst economic collapse.
Now, while Israel is quietly preserved and doing just fine, things are getting really, really bad for the rest of Egypt. As the famine intensified, we see this massive systemic reorganization of the Egyptian state under Joseph's administration. To survive, the indigenous Egyptian population entered this desperate cascade. First, they surrendered their money. Then they handed over their livestock. And finally, they surrendered the very ground beneath their feet to the crown just to get enough grain to survive. Except for the priestly allotments, literally all the land shifted entirely to Pharaoh. And the human cost here was just staggering. The Egyptian people were essentially reduced to state-dependent tenant farmers. To really underscore the severity of this imperial consolidation, a permanent 20% tax burden was placed on them by Joseph's administration. We are talking about a complete and total economic collapse and a massive restructuring of the greatest empire on earth.
So here is the absolutely crucial point we need to see. This stark economic contrast. While the native population lost literally everything to human imperial rule, Israel was uniquely shielded. By royal decree and divine oversight, they were granted designated property in Goshen. And they didn't just barely survive either, they were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. This deliberately echoes the original creation mandate and those covenantal promises God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God actually used human administrative structures to preserve global life while uniquely shielding the line of the promised seed.
And this brings us to the real climax of our explainer, Section 4, Jacob's Oath of Return. Jacob ends up living in Egypt for 17 years. He's watching his family transition from desperate refugees into this thriving, multiplying, property-owning people who are completely exempt from the Egyptian serfdom happening all around them. But sensing his impending death, Jacob has a massive choice to make. He could so easily just embrace this new reality. It would have been simple, incredibly comfortable, to just stay in Goshen forever. But no, he refuses to be seduced by the temporary prosperity, setting up his ultimate act of faith. He actually summons Joseph and gives him this incredibly specific command. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. Now, this isn't just some nostalgic sentimentality for his old hometown. Not at all. It is a profound, solemn declaration that Israel's true inheritance remains eternally tied to the promised land of Canaan. It's a total rejection of Egypt's definition of prosperity. He's saying that temporal abundance in a foreign land could never, ever substitute for the promised rest of Yahweh's kingdom.
And to make sure this happens, Jacob doesn't just casually ask for a favor. He demands a solemn oath. Joseph must place his hand under Jacob's thigh. Now, I know that gesture sounds totally bizarre to us today, but here's a really surprising fact. In the ancient world, this was literally the absolute highest level of a binding contract. By demanding this specific binding oath, Jacob decisively refuses permanent naturalization in the world's most powerful empire. He is stating, both physically and legally, that his people do not belong to Pharaoh.
Right after Joseph swears this oath, Israel, Jacob, bows in worship. Depending on your translation, it says he bowed at the top of his staff. This final physical act signifies Jacob's complete, absolute reliance on Yahweh's promise plan. It proves that death itself cannot sever his connection to that divine oath. It shows us that the bearer of the divine promise, no matter how outwardly frail or vulnerable they might seem, holds true preeminence over any worldly power. Let's look at Section 5, a legacy beyond Egypt. Because Jacob's physical oath of return, it doesn't just stay stuck in the book of Genesis. It echoes powerfully throughout history, finding its ultimate fulfillment in the New Testament. The authors organically connect this historical reality to God's massive redemptive purposes. The author of Hebrews frames Jacob leaning on his staff as an eschatological act of faith, meaning he was looking way forward, beyond temporary prosperity, to God's ultimate future. In Acts, Stephen uses Jacob's descent into Egypt to show that God's redemptive presence was never geographically confined to one spot. And in Romans, Paul takes it even further, showing that the physical, earthly promise of Canaan was actually the foundational archetype for a cosmic, universal inheritance. Jacob's historical refusal to be buried in Egypt perfectly mirrors the believer's refusal to find ultimate citizenship in the present worldly order. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought. Think about it. Jacob was surrounded by the wealth, the stability, and the protection of literally the greatest empire on earth. Yet he made a binding, ironclad oath that his bones belonged somewhere else. He completely knew the difference between temporary shelter and a true inheritance. So consider this for yourself. In your own life, where are you placing your ultimate hope and trust? Where is your ultimate citizenship truly anchored? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating historical narrative with me today. Keep seeking, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.